This is our top story at this hour. The United States doublespeak stands exposed as a report by a think tank suggests that the Biden government imported more oil from Moscow than New Delhi did amid Ukraine-Russia war. India's decision to import oil from Russia had drawn sharp criticism from the West. From US to European leaders, the world had tried to corner India of its decision. But now the report from Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air has exposed their hypocrisy.
When it comes to oil purchases, sanctions, etc., I just note that there are carve-outs for energy purchases. Of course, we're encouraging countries not to purchase additional energy supplies from Russia. Every country is differently situated, has different needs, requirements, but we're looking to allies and partners not to increase their purchases of Russian energy.
By the organization shows a sharp rise in oil shipments to India and Egypt, which has grabbed a lot of eyeballs. However, the data goes on to show that Germany and Italy remains the top importers of Russian resources, even as the conflict started on February 24th. The statistics revealed by the think tank shows 71% of the total fossil fuel exports, including crude oil, piped gas, LNG and coal, are exported to European countries. The Indian government has attributed its oil deal with the Kremlin to hefty discounts on crude oil that the country was getting, as the Russian government was reeling under strict sanctions imposed on it, barring energy, food and pharma products. This is the reply by Indian Foreign Minister when asked about oil imports from Russia.
That we are against the conflict. We are for dialogue and diplomacy. We are for urgent cessation of violence. And we are prepared to contribute in whatever way to these objectives. I noticed you refer to oil purchases. If you are looking at energy purchases from Russia, I would suggest that your attention should be focused on Europe, which probably we do buy some energy which is necessary for our energy security, but I suspect, looking at the figures, probably our total purchases for the month would be less than what Europe does in an afternoon.
The European Union aims to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and gas by 2/3 by the end of the year and to zero by the end of 2027. Germany, and the EU's largest economy, has announced plans to end its dependence on Russian oil by the close of this year. While the EU has not imposed an embargo, many companies in Europe have stopped buying Russian crude voluntarily or promised to do so when their long-term contracts expire. Major global trading houses are planning to reduce fuel purchases from Moscow as early as May 15th. This is to avoid falling foul of European Union sanctions on Russia. Ambassador Dilip Sinha from New Delhi is joining us now. He is a former permanent representative to India to the United Nations. Dilip, thank you very much for making time and welcome to WION.
Thank you, Eric.
Now, on one end, the US is urging countries world over to boycott Russian products, and yet on the other, following this revelation, the US is still dependent on Russian fossil fuels than India. What's your take on that?
Well, welcome to the real world. In the real world, hypocrisy and doublespeak are the name of the game. In any case, every country wants other countries to do as it says, not as it does. Of course, America's dependence upon Russian oil and gas is much less than Europe's. And Europe has been extremely careful not to impose sanctions on the import of oil and gas from Russia. But in any case, international pressures are put by countries on others, especially on those that are vulnerable to such pressure and those that show any sign of dependency. For example, Russia has just imposed sanctions, has stopped the supply of natural gas to Poland and to Bulgaria, but not to countries like Germany and Italy, because they are much bigger buyers, largely because Russia wants to punish Poland and Bulgaria for having taken a strong position on the Ukrainian crisis and for having sheltered so many Ukrainian refugees and for providing passage for weapons to go into Ukraine. So again, because these countries are more vulnerable to Russian pressure than, say, a country like Germany, Russia is quite happy to put pressure upon them. Similarly, America realizes that India is vulnerable because although we import very little oil from Russia, and America knows that, the fact is that America needs Russia. America needs both, India needs America as its economic partner and also its strategic partner, and therefore India needs to listen to America, and therefore America feels that it can give advice and sermonize India.
Right. You are right to say that this is the real world, Mr. Dilip. But is this yet another case of the West, not just US, not practicing what it's preaching?
Absolutely. It is certainly so, because as the study itself shows, although America does not really need to import oil from Russia, because America itself is a very large, in fact, the largest producer of oil in the world, and therefore its dependence upon Russian oil and gas is extremely low, and it can easily put an end to that. As compared to that, countries like Germany are extremely dependent upon Russian oil and natural gas, especially natural gas, because natural gas is not as portable as oil is. And Germany has invested very heavily in these gas pipelines to import gas from Russia. And it is extremely difficult for it to switch over quickly to some other form of oil or some other source of supply of natural gas. So in these circumstances, a country like Germany has to be very cautious and careful. And that's why, as you mentioned, Germany plans to stop the import of natural gas from Russia by 2027, which is a good 5 years from now, whereas oil, it can stop much earlier, much faster. Now, in the case of India, India is totally dependent upon oil imports from various countries, and India has been importing oil from various countries, including Russia, although the Russian quantum is very small, less than 2% of our needs. Nevertheless, the fact that oil prices have gone up and the Russian oil is available to us at a somewhat lower price, not really very low, because although there are deep discounts, the fact is that the Russian oil comes, the shipping and insurance costs will have to be paid for by Indian importers. And that means that the cost will actually will be much higher than the actual price at which it's being purchased from the Russian ships and Russian companies. But nevertheless, for a poor country like India, any kind of discount in pricing is important. And it's also important to remember that this idea of imposing sanctions on countries for political reasons is not part of our foreign policy. We don't impose sanctions on countries, unlike the US or, for example, many European countries, or some European countries do, to impose sanctions.
All right, let me ask this. Despite making public statements, Europe remains heavily dependent on Russia for its energy needs, which has forced the EU to stop short of banning almost everything, but not the fuel. How do you see that?
Precisely, they have to be realistic to realize that they cannot stop the import of Russian oil and gas, especially gas, immediately, because it cannot be replaced by other sources. And heating, particularly in Europe, is dependent upon natural gas. They moved to natural gas in order to cut their carbon emissions, and now they're dependent upon it, and they cannot do that because, as it is, heating costs in Europe have gone up. They are waiting for summer to come in so that they have a bit of relief, but nevertheless, replacing natural gas imported from Russia will take time, and we have to see how seriously the Europeans go about this, because natural gas is not easy to transport. Europe is looking at countries like Algeria, but Algeria's production is much lower than Russia's. So there'll be other sources perhaps will have to be looked into. But nevertheless, Europe is being realistic in excluding oil and natural gas from the sanctions that they've imposed on Russia.
Finally, Ambassador Dilip, and this is very brief, how do you see India's position vis-a-vis the West and Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, my personal view is that we should have joined the resolution in asking Russia to withdraw and for deploring the invasion, because it is an invasion and the International Court of Justice has declared it to be in violation of international law. Sanctions is a completely different matter because, as I said, it is not part of our policy to impose sanctions on countries. We haven't imposed sanctions on countries that are hostile to us or have actually invaded us. So that would be a different issue altogether. But I think certainly on the issue of the principle of it, and also in terms of our longer term national interest, it is we should have taken a clear stand on the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mr. Dilip Sinha is a former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. Ambassador, thank you very much for making time and for talking to WION today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.